So the IRS recently came out that the plan sponsor needs to keep the documentation on hand for any loans that the participant takes or any hardship withdrawals. So a lot of times we see during our audits that the plan sponsor says, oh, the record keeper keeps that for me. So when they do that, they haven't actually seen any of the documentation. So when we go through and we're reviewing their files and they have to sign a form saying that that transaction is correct, they need to make sure they have that support for that. So you may need the medical invoices for that withdrawal or an eviction notice to know that it's correct. Also, you'll run into problems years later. So if the Department of Labor comes in a few years later and does an audit, they expect you to have that on hand. If you have changed record keepers, they may not have that. You may not have access to that anymore. Plus, if the participant has left, it's really hard to get that documentation from them afterwards. So it's really important up front that the plan sponsor keeps that documentation on hand with them in their files. So it's also important when you do loans that you get a copy of that application and that amortization schedule, because this way, if you switch record keepers, you have that on hand and you're not relying on them to keep that documentation because you may not have access to it anymore. So a lot of times when we're doing audits, we go out there and we go through the documentation and we check to make sure what they have. And most of the time, even when they're relying on that third-party administrator to process that withdrawal, they have to sign and certify that transaction is correct. So we had one plan administrator, he would sign them, he wasn't really reviewing them, he wasn't going through making sure that he actually had the documentation on hand. And we're like, there's little fine print under your signature that you're saying that it's a valid withdrawal. How do you know it's a valid withdrawal without that documentation? So he had to then go back to all his participants and try to get that documentation. And he realized he had that fiduciary responsibility. If you have any questions about the type of documentation, how long you should maintain it for, or what exactly you need to keep in your files, contact CRI.